Welcome back to Economics with Professor Klein at Cuesta College. Today's video is going to be about demand and supply shifts, and we're just going to illustrate what happens to equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, because remember that equilibrium has to be 2 points on a graph, not just one. And what happens if we have a single shift, and then particularly for this video, we're focusing on double shifts. What if we have both a shift in demand and a shift in supply? All right, so we've used lecture to go through what will cause demand or supply to shift, right? And so if we just start with the basic equilibrium graph, at this point, price will always be on the vertical axis, all right? And then later on, when we get to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it'll be price level. Quantity will always be on the horizontal axis, all right? Then we have a downward sloping demand due to the law of demand, which says that price and quantity demanded, is inversely related, right? So there's a negative relationship there. Supply is upward sloping because the law of supply tells us that as the price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. So it's a positive slope, right? And so equilibrium is where, right, where the law of demand gets canceled out by the law of supply. How do we see that? Quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, right? Now, what we don't often observe in life, in experiencing economics, what we don't often observe is, does quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied? In economics, we call this a market clearing price, right? Because there's a special price where this occurs. And so the price where this occurs, well, what we're saying is that there are no more surpluses, right? When quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, we have a surplus. And what happens when there's a surplus? Well, the producer has to drop their price in order to be able to sell more. And it's also the price where there are no longer shortages. So when we have things like a toilet paper shortage, what's going on? Well, they're not raising their price fast enough. Price is a rationing mechanism. And what that means is make sure that the person who values it the most gets it first. All right, so price, equilibrium price, where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, where we eliminate a surplus or a shortage. So this is the point. And so again, this is a graph. So the quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied, here's that equilibrium quantity, right? And that's what the star is for. And this is the price at which we're able to achieve that. So here's our equilibrium price. Right? So we start off with the idea that whatever market we're looking at is in equilibrium, that it has this market clearing price and that there are no surpluses or shortages, right? So when we're trying to find a price of a new product, and the example that I often give is if you're going to go sell some cupcakes at a farmer's market, you may not know what the equilibrium price is when you first show up. And then what's also fun about economics is that the market may shift from one week to the next, right? So let's look at what happens to equilibrium. And what we do experience about economics is price. This is the one thing we observe. We kind of expect that if we're observing this price, that it's probably market clearing. Otherwise, there would be some surplus or shortage that emerges to tell us to raise or lower the price, right? Okay, so if demand shifts bloop, bloop, to the right, anything that would cause us to want more of this product, a trend, a fad, we expect the price to go up in the future, the price of the complement that goes along with it has dropped, right? Or the price of the substitute is going up, so I'm going to buy this one instead. Any of these things that will cause demand to shift right. Okay, so toilet paper, we saw demand shift right. Why? People were panic buying. There was essentially a trend of, if somebody else buys us out of toilet paper, then there won't be any left for me. People were concerned about shortages, right? And had stores picked up on it faster, they could have made a lot more money and there would have been fewer shortages. They could have just doubled the price of toilet paper. So look at later, price gouging laws that prevent prices from rising very quickly during a natural disaster are an example of a price ceiling sometimes. All right, so if demand shifts to the right, we never know how much demand might shift to the right, all right? It could be a small shift, it could be a large shift, but if it's the only shift that's occurring, we don't have to worry about whether it's a large or small shift because the result will be the same. We're not going to say by how much things are going to change. Oh boy, we already have enough problems just predicting what will happen if the price will go up or down. So we don't try to say the price will go up by 10%, 20%. There's too many things outside of our control in economics to be able to do that. So instead, we're just simply going to make predictions about if demand increases, and I'm going to use shifts right because that's how it appears on the graph, right? Then, ceteris paribus, assuming that everything else in the marketplace is staying constant, no shifts essentially to supply, then equilibrium price will rise, right? Here's one possible outcome. Here's a second possible outcome. We could keep going on up. But as we look at the equilibrium price, right, the new price is higher. Boop. Equilibrium quantity, as we look at these possibilities, they're also going to be higher, right? So we're going to experience something where there's going to be both an increase to the price of this product as well as an increase to the quantity of this product, right? So then what if demand shifts left? Well, we could just kind of extrapolate, which means using what we've just experienced and applying it to the new scenario. If we were out here and moving backwards, right? So if demand were to shift left, then the result is that equilibrium price would fall, right? We don't want this item. We're not going to pay as much. Consumer surplus is going to go down, as well as quantity will fall. We don't want this item. We're not going to buy as much, right? So if demand shifts right, if we are seeing things that cause us to want this more, then equilibrium price goes up and equilibrium quantity goes up, right? So demand usually follows the way that we have experienced economics up till now, right? Because we are naturally consumers. We buy things. We shop on Amazon. I do it all the time, right? Or on Costco. We buy things. What do we do less often? What we do less often is supply to the market, right? So I'm just going to reset this graph. All right, downward sloping demand, because price and quantity are inversely related when we think about demand. Upward sloping supply, because price and quantity supplied to the market are directly related. Here's our initial, right, assuming that this market is in equilibrium as we start. Here's our initial price and quantity. So let's say we experience something where supply is increasing, right? We have a new cupcake manufacturer join our area. If we don't think about right and left, this gets really confusing. So that's why we use right and left. So an increase in supply is shown as a shift to the right. Right? So here's one possible shift to the right. Here's an even larger shift right. So if supply shifts right, then price, what's going to happen to price? Well, look at what's going on as we're shifting right. Here's one possible outcome. Anything along this way. Price is falling, right? As the cupcake manufacturer opens up a new factory near us, the price of cupcakes, ceteris paribus, is going to fall. What's going to happen to the quantity of cupcakes? Well, as we look at this, where are all of these being located? The quantity is still going up. Now, as we think of these together, it makes a lot more sense. Supply is going up. Well, obviously, there's going to be more cupcakes in SLO County if there's more supply. How are we going to sell more cupcakes? We're going to have to lower the price per cupcake. That's the only way we're going to get new customers to come and eat these excess cupcakes, right? So that's why if supply shifts right, we're going to see a decrease in price and an increase in quantity. Now we can extrapolate from that, right? If supply shifts left, okay, now we have, if we're starting here, now we're moving in this direction. And we can also just simply extrapolate. If there's less supply, well, let's think about quantity first. Less supply means it's going to be less for us to buy. If there's less for us to buy, what's going to happen to the price of those items? It's going to go up, right? Okay, so that's demand and supply when they are by themselves. But it's really helpful if you have this information as you consider the double shift, all right? So let's do a double shift. I'm going to pause while I erase and re-summarize my board. All right, so now that I have erased and re-summarized, right? So I have over here, demand shifts right, price and quantity will increase as a result. If demand shifts left, price and quantity will both decline as a result. If supply shifts right, more people coming in to supply this item, quantity will go up, but price will fall. If supply shifts left, there will be less quantity and therefore a higher price. So let's consider what's going to happen if two of these factors happen at the same time, right? Because it's all lovely to think about, well, there's simply a new supplier in the market, but why might there be a new supplier in the market? Maybe because there is now a trend for this product, right? So we could absolutely see some examples in the marketplace where supply is shifting right at the same time that demand is shifting right, because they are trying to supply more to this increased demand. So let's look at what would happen in that particular case, right? Well, let's start with our simple shifts. If demand shifts right, it's telling us that price and quantity are going up. We don't know how big. Again, it doesn't matter by how much. It just matters that it's changing and that in which direction it's going. Now, supply is also shifting right, but we don't know by how much, right? And so this blue is not showing up very well. There we go. Well, now, all of these things are possible. Now, notice there's two ways to really consider how to do double shifts. Well, as I look at this, oh goodness, price, I have some options where price is higher. I have some outcomes where price is lower. I have some outcomes where price is exactly the same. So we don't know if price is going to stay the same. We don't know if price is going to rise or going to fall. And part of the way that we could see that is what we predicted before. When demand shifts right, price goes up. And when supply shifts right, price goes down. We don't know which one is going to be a larger shift. So what's going to happen here, we use the term price is unknown, or the term I was going to use, ambiguous, because that's a fun college word, right? So price is going to be unknown if we have both a shift to the right in supply, an increase in supply, as well as an increase in demand. We don't know what's going to happen to price. We do know, right, as we look at both of these options, we do know, and also with the graph, that quantity is going to increase. People want more, and there are more people to supply it. Quantity is going to increase. And so this is what happens every time we have two shifts. And when I mean two, I don't mean demand going right and then going left. That would just be confusing. We just wouldn't know what is really going to happen to demand. But when we have both a factor that is shifting demand and a factor that is shifting supply, and as I mentioned, this happens in markets all the time. Essentially what happens is it takes a while for the market to find its new equilibrium. So if they ask an economist what's going to happen to the price, you know, people have this there's this fad that people really want this product that I'm selling. Should I increase the price? The question is, well, how many competitors do you have, right? And so I can't remember which president, but one of them said, please find me a one-handed economist, because one of the things that economists always say is, well, on the one hand, price may rise if your demand is increasing by more than your supply. On the other hand, price may increase price may fall if demand is not going up by as much as supply, right? So one way to think about these double shifts is really to make use of this summary, right? If you like graphs, draw the graph. If you like just following, then you can have this, right? These are things that you should logically be able to work through. And then when you have two, simply looking at, well, what do the predictions of both tell me, right? So ignoring the graph entirely for now, we can use this summary as an expectation. So if I were going to read an article that says demand for whatever product is falling, I need to understand that for the graph, that is, demand is shifting left. And the expectation is that price and quantity will decrease. And that's what those down arrows are saying. Right? If it says at the same time, well, supply for this product is increasing because they just opened up a new shop or a new factory, right? Well, we've got some problems here, because supply increasing, that's shifting right. That is going to tell me that price is going to fall and quantity is going to rise. So what can I say about if both of these are occurring at the same time? The outcome, price will decrease, right? Because they're both saying that price will decrease. Quantity will be unknown or ambiguous. Right? So again, anytime we're dealing with the double shift, you can simply look at the single shift and what happens as a result. And if they're both predicting the same direction, then that will happen. But if anytime we have a double shift, one variable of equilibrium will be known and one will be unknown. Right? And so that's the thing about economics, and we're a little bit of weather people. There's always an aspect that is unknown, right? How long will it be hot? Maybe until Thursday. When will it rain? We think in October, right? So these are the things that are going on here. So I hope that helps. This is a great table to have as you attempt your homework. You're welcome to have this table as you attempt your test. And I hope that this has been helpful. Again, if you have any questions, send me an email or a message on Canvas. Have a great day.